So this is the Pentecost picture or artwork for the St. John's Bible. So this is the arrival of the Holy Spirit. And so part of what we believe about mission, part of about what we believe about what we are tasked to do as children of God, as followers of Jesus Christ, is directly related to the arrival of the Holy Spirit, of what the Holy Spirit is doing and guiding us. So after the resurrection, after the ascension, and then with the arrival of the Holy Spirit, it paints this particular question for us. And so we tied that to this reading from Acts 4, which we kind of all agreed didn't really sound like the church today, this communal expression where no one's in need and everybody held things in common. And so while this is lovely, it doesn't necessarily equate to where we are today. So we ask the question of how do we have an understanding of mission that allows this to be valid and something that we're doing to be valid as well, even though our expression does not look exactly as what the apostles did. So that got us to this idea of Missio Dei, which is that it's the mission of God. It is God's undertaking. And so there are three kind of tenets we developed about this idea of Missio Dei, is that God's mission is eternal. It's connecting us to something that is beyond our understanding of time. So God's working of mission is outside of what we can understand really in our humanness. So this eternal nature of what's going on is God's to have. The second tenet being that the church is then only missional when it is participating in God's mission. So that means that because it is God's mission to hold, we are only invited into it, and we are actually only participating in mission when it aligns with what God is doing in the world. So that allows us to have this connection in saying that what we are doing is driven by God, is tasked to us by God, but it leaves space to say that there are missional practices that are not part of what God is doing in the world because they don't align with what we believe about God. And then we tied that to the Lambeth 1998 conference, which is the meeting of all the bishops that get together every 10 years, and it says mission goes out from God. Mission is God's way of loving and saving the world. So mission is never our invention or choice. So it's a little kind of flip there of saying God is doing this whether we're involved with it or not. And this is God completing the goodness of God and being out in the world. So the church is only participating in that when it is part of what God is doing. And so that begs the question, how do we know what God is doing? What do we know God is like? And so that leads us to our third tenet here, which is that Jesus is our epistemology. Jesus is our way of understanding what God is like. The life and teachings and death and resurrection of Jesus Christ show us what God is like, and therefore our missional identities and our clues to what is going on in the Missio Dei are tied back to the things that we see Jesus doing and the things that we have Jesus teaching us. And so we looked at these, which are called the 5 marks of mission: to proclaim the good news of the kingdom, to teach, baptize, and to nurture new believers, to respond to human need by loving service, to seek to transform unjust structures of society, to challenge violence of every kind, and to pursue peace and reconciliation, and then to strive and safeguard the integrity of creation and sustain and renew the life of the earth. So these are one example of a missional identity. This is something that the Anglican Communion and the Episcopal Church has put out there as part of helping us understand when we're saying this word mission, this is part of what we're talking about. These are missional expressions. So almost everything that we do as a church should be tied back to one of these missional identities, because these are all things that we can tie back to what Jesus is doing. So this is not doctrine, but this is a helpful way of saying this is what a missional identity could look like. That's where we got last week. Honky-dory, everybody's happy, wonderful, we got a statement. What happens when we get it wrong? And so that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about this idea of missional malpractice. So it's kind of hard to see here, but in the St. John's Bible that we have this lovely picture from Acts, and it says, "to the ends of the earth." which is a statement, I can't remember exactly which chapter, but it's talking about going and making disciples, of Jesus being involved with everyone's lives to the end of the earth. So the way you understand God and the way you understand your missional expression, this is a really difficult wording if you have a particular way of understanding the world. And this has been used and abused in many ways to say that we are to go to the ends of the earth and make sure that everyone is a Christian in the exact way that I believe Christians should be. So if you believe that, this is problematic. If you believe more in a holistic, loving God that is contextual, relational, this is about being involved with everybody. It's a statement of inclusion, of saying that part of what God's mission is telling us to do is to be involved with everyone's lives to the end of the earth. And that's two different ways of believing that. And so throughout history, there are many examples of poor theology that have led to disastrous outcomes. And there are some that have really never been rectified and we continue to live with their ghosts. And sometimes we even continue to use them in a harmful way. And so we could spend hours talking about missional malpractice this morning. I'm sure we all have different stories of it. But we're going to look more at what are some of the root causes that are so important to understanding where we get into missional malpractice today. And I think or at least the way I understand it, and a claim that I would make, is that a lot of this comes back to the idea of colonization, this idea of imperialism. And that continues to very much affect our missional identities today, especially depending on what type of church background you're coming from. So I want to start us here. This is a quote by Ken Burns, the famous documentarian. I can't remember exactly where I pulled this from, but I think this quote applies just as much to the church as it does to American history. So he's speaking about American history here, but just flip that word, apply it to church as well, okay? So he says, being an American means reckoning with a history fraught with violence and injustice. Ignoring that reality in favor of mythology is not only wrong, but also dangerous. The dark chapters of American history have just as much to teach us, if not more, than the glorious ones, and often the two are intertwined. As some question how to teach American history to our children, and even question the history itself, I urge us to confront the hard truth and to trust our children with it, because a truly great nation is one that can acknowledge its failures. And I think that sums up a lot of where we are in American history right now, but also as we talk about some of these difficult, dark pasts of the church, of which we are a part, of which we are complicit, of which we are in a tradition that benefits from this dark past, what does it mean to engage with that and understand it and still be a part of this church and how it moves forward? So I just think that's a really helpful way of framing this. Yes?
Also a helpful way of understanding the problems PBS and NPR are having at this very moment.
Right. I mean, Ken Burns is speaking. That's right. Yeah. I mean, he's speaking right to the nexus of this. I think we're questioning what it means to critique, what it means to understand that we are not perfect. And that's going to get into some of this other stuff that we're going to talk about this morning. So I just wanted to find some terms before we get started. A lot of this I'm taking from my professor of missional theology, which is Dr. Robert Heaney. He's up at VTS, so I'm taking some of his definitions here. But colonization is the practice of commandeering particular pieces or tracts of land by outsiders motivated by a desire for some kind of increased profit, power, or security. Colonialism is the wider movement of such colonization that takes place in a variety of places across history. Imperialism, the ambition for preeminent power and control, often articulated in government policy papers, trading priorities, defense strategies, literatures, curricula, and sermons. And such power can be achieved through colonization, trade agreements, and military threat. And whatever the means, the end is always for a political center to exercise sovereignty over other societies. So I think we can make the case here that these are antithetical to Jesus. These are antithetical to the Missio Dei. This is about human power here that we're looking at. So these are terms that we're going to use. We have a history of colonialism. We come from a colonial past. We are, again, this church in particular is benefactors of a colonial past. The entirety of America is coming from a system of colonial powers with our historical connections to England, how we founded, what happens. And so this imperialist model, too, I think is ingrained in a piece of American history. And so that imperialism takes a different sort of blend and trend after the colonial times here in America. So looking at this, I stole this image from Brad Hoff, he's the indigenous minister for the Episcopal Church, and he does a fantastic presentation on what the church does to our native populations. And this is just a fantastic image to look at imperialism. I'm not going to get close to the microphone or the speaker here, but what do you see here?
Going west.
Say that?
Going west.
Going west, that's right. So this great Western move.
That sort of deified idol of America.
That's perfect, yes. We have this very white Anglo-Saxon, blonde hair, blue eyes lady, Liberty perhaps, draped in white for purity, traipsing across the land. It's kind of hard to see in the shadows, but what's there?
You see, looks like the Americans driven.
That's exactly right. And notice how the light plays here. You've got this really dark area to say that's the darkness, and we're driving that out. It's hard to see, but wrapped around her arm there, that coil, telephone wire, telegraph wire. And so she's got it, she's bringing it across. We see trains, we see ideals of progress from that time period. You've got settlers moving west here in wagons. You've got workmen down at the bottom here setting up this society. And so this is such a foundational painting to explain a bit of the theology that we're talking about here, this idea that this is us painting our imperialist nation. We are driven by God. This is what is right. This is what we should be doing. Andrew.
Well, the idea behind it was that these nomads weren't doing anything with the land, so it was up for grabs.
That's right.
So the perfect segue. So we are inheritors of this imperialism, this idea, but we are certainly not the originators of it. And a lot of this theology of how this gets connected to the church, we can tie back to the 1400s in this time where the doctrine of discovery starts to be put together. So the doctrine of discovery is a series of papal decrees that calls for the colonization of Africa in the Western Hemisphere, the taking of land, the subjugation and religious indoctrinations of the indigenous people in those regions. So yes, please.
What's that painting named?
I don't actually know. So great question. American Progress. Dan found it. He did some Googling over there while I was speaking. Thanks, Dan. So we've got two documents that we need to look at, or at least just be aware of. We have the Dum Diversas, which is in 1452, and the Romanus Pontifex. And these were papal bulls issued by Pope Nicholas V to King Alfonso of Portugal, confirming to the crown of Portugal dominion over lands in Africa, along with encouraging the seizure of the lands of the Saracen Turks and non-Christians. They granted permission for the enslavement of such people. So let's look at some of the language of the Dum Diversas here. We grant you, by these present documents, with our apostolic authority, full and free permission to invade, search out, capture, and subjugate the Saracens and pagans and any other unbelievers and enemies of Christ wherever they may be, as well as in their their kingdoms, their duchies, counties, principalities, and other property, and to reduce their persons into perpetual servitude. Whew. Fun language, right? Does that sound like the Missio Dei? Does that sound like our 5 marks of mission? All right, good. Okay, I just wanted to check. I don't know. Another one to be aware of, this is called the Intercetera, 1493, so same timeline there, but Pope Alexander VI issues a papal decree in which he authorizes Spain and Portugal to colonize the Americas and its native peoples as discovered subjects. This was the first use of that discovered word, so this doctrine of discovery that we're getting into. The decree asserts the rights of Spain and Portugal to colonize, convert, and enslave discovered Africans. So just painting some of this very early understandings of where we get to our slave trade, of how we understand this. It starts early, and it continues to ripple through our societies today. And it's tied back to theological documents, which is really important. Yeah.
Have these documents been rescinded?
That's a great question. That's more of a Catholic question. I don't know where they are in this. I hope they have. Brad Hoff's presentation talks about a lot of that. I would have to go back and look at it.
There is a movement going on now to remove the documents of discoveries. Native Americans are pushing this, and it's in the Episcopal Church.
Yeah, there is an Episcopal movement to repudiate the doctrine of discovery. So it gets to that question of, this is pre-Anglican Church, this is pre-Church of England, so these are part of our history as well. So we do have claim to say that these were wrong. We were wrong to participate in these, even though it's well before our history even begins, at least in a limited Anglican view of it, but that's certainly part of it. And there is a drive out of General Convention to repudiate these as well.
Is the word African there, the last word? Is that implying our indigenous people?
No, so this is...
It says in the top part, Americas and native peoples.
Yeah. I would have to go back and look at this. I haven't read the document in full, so I'm pulling this from someone else's slides. But these are foundational documents to understanding this. But we're going to pivot now to what this looks like in Church of England. So I think just to make the connection here, that this is all connected to what happens when we get to the Church of England. So at least 100 years further, this idea of divine providence pops up, which is very much a part of doctrine of discovery. Divine providence also gets us to that American exceptionalism painting we just had, of this idea that something has called us and told us that we are the way in which God should be working in the world through us and through the way that we understand what we're doing. And so this is from Dr. Heaney here. He says, the British Empire is determined or allowed by God to be the means of blessing for the world. Consequently, that which is outside the providential work of God is other and to be resisted and remade. That England is a nation favored by God includes the notion, the requisite practices which emerge from it, that the Church of England is herself a peculiar vessel for God. Both indigenous peoples and unregenerate colonists or colonialists had therefore to be rescued from perdition. So this is interesting. I think we often get to a place of like black and white, morally wrong, morally right. But I think the way we can start to problematize this a little bit is that it goes back to what we believe about prayer. So if you've ever come to a confirmation class, if you've ever come to a baptism class, you've probably heard us talk about this idea of lex oriendi, lex credendi, the law of prayer is the law of belief. So this idea that prayer shapes believing. If what your church is believing, if what your church is telling you about the world, telling you about God, is fixed in a certain way, the outcomes of your belief, and therefore your actions, your mission, are going to have a causal sort of flow to them. So what you believe about God has a direct impact on how you act in the world in relation to God. So that all ties back to this prayer shapes believing, lex orandi, lex credendi. So what Dr. Heaney is saying here is that part of divine providence is the belief that the Church of England is this peculiar vessel of God, we've got what God needs for the world. We've been told we've got to go out and do this in this particular way. And the way that we understand God and the way that God is interacting with the world is only through people finding our particular way of worshiping and loving God and being in this strict communion structure. So that's a very logical pattern to take. I think about this a lot when I'm on the highways. If you've ever driven through the South, you've probably seen these big billboards that say these words, Jesus save my soul. And so I don't know exactly who's paying for these, but they've spent a lot of money on these. But it comes from this same sort of idea. If you understand the relationship between God and humanity to be wrapped up with that sort of individual expression of salvation, it's vastly important for a person to say those words as if they are somehow magical, and that is somehow the only thing preventing God from redeeming that person is that they've never said these words before. And so if that's the belief about God, is that God is only interacting with those that have chosen it, then you have this you can draw the line between that and a missional expression that has you put up billboards that say these words, and you're good. We don't have to worry about a relationship. Don't worry about those teachings. You want to come into the church, but just say these words and you'll be fine. That's the same thing we're talking about here of lex credendi, lex orandi, that the belief that you have impacts what you are doing out in the world. And so it's the same thing. We can demonize divine providence. We can demonize divine or doctrine of discovery, and we should certainly say that this is not true. But I also think it comes back to an idea that has people trying to live out a missional expression about the God that they believe. So they are living forward into their belief system. It's just not in the right way. And so that's what I want to tie us back to this Missio Dei of trying to understand what God does through Jesus Christ and how we can connect our missional practices to something that we see Jesus doing. So the British Empire is doing this by conquering and going out and imposing their belief system on those through military might, through imperialism, and calling it whatever they want to call it. I mean, they do call themselves the British Empire, but we have this colonialist mindset that happens for hundreds of years, and we get colonies, we get people that are believing in the faith through the actions of divine providence. But do we see Jesus conquering? Do we see Jesus using force and might to accomplish the kingdom of God? We do not. And so this allows us, this is just an example, but this allows us to say that there are missional practices that are not part of the Missio Dei. And this is a massive example of it, but for us, this is what I'm trying to set up, is this idea that we can use a set of principles to say, here's something that we believe is true about our identity and how we want to be working in the world, and this is why it fits into this, and at the same time say, this is not what we believe. We don't believe this to be true about God. So we can do that with divine providence. And I think part of what is happening here, to go even deeper into this, is this idea of Western hegemonic intent, which is one of my favorite sayings. It just rolls off the tongue. Say it with me. Western hegemonic intent. Ooh, that's nice. Hegemony is the ideological dominance or attempt at dominance of one social group over others. And so this is Dr. Heaney quoting African theologian John M. Beatty. And John says, "It might be assumed that throughout the communion and wherever else Anglicanism is taught, its proximity to the castle remains." That is to say, Henry VIII, Cranmer, Elizabeth I, Jewel, Hooker, et al. Are all part of the story passed on. This, along with claims to apostolic and biblical tradition, is the assumed historic and theological substructure of a globalized Anglican communion. However, tradition has not only meant connections to the past. Tradition has been a globalizing imposition of foreign categories, and its corollary, the debasement of others. Missionaries and their converts often exhibited a bulldozer mentality, which assumed that indigenous traditions were demonic and therefore needed to be swept aside. Too often, missionaries scandalized, vandalized, and brutally tore cultural life apart. For many colonized people, it seemed that colonizers took their land and missionaries took their identity. Colonization is, therefore, both physical and epistemic violence. And so this is part of a critique of the Western church that we've fallen into syncretism, which, if you remember when we were talking about the prophets, one of the major things that the prophets rail against is this syncretistic blending of the one tradition of Judaism, this nature of one God, with other gods. We're doing the same thing, in this, at least in this critique, of blending our church tradition with the theories of Western civilization, of saying that our progress is tied to the church progress rather than God's progress. So our imperialist ideals, which are deeply rooted within our understanding of ourselves, are driving us forward. And we've linked that with the church. We have historical precedent of that. And so what Mbiti is saying here, there's no real clean point of departure for when we're talking about what our tradition is. So this proximity to the castle, as he uses, which is this lovely phrase of talking about, well, when we think about what Anglican identity is, we go back to all of these foundational documents. We go to the early church history. But that does not necessarily point us to anything other than, well, that's what they believed at that time. And what has believed at that time has led to this syncretism where the church is now being connected to civilization and to the ideals of that. And so what we're trying to do is subvert that a little bit more and go to the ideals of the Missio Dei. So if we don't believe in like this foundational piece of saying, well, that's clear doctrine, that's exactly what we have to believe, it lets us open up an idea of saying there might be a deeper way of looking at this, because you can always go back to something else. You can keep looking back and back and back and back to see what did these people believe? What did these people believe? We can't just pass on a tradition because that's what people were doing, and that's what leads to this imperialist mindset. When we connect it deeper to what God is doing, to take it a step away from what the humans in the world are doing, that's the powerful move of the Missio Dei, is to take it one step further. Yes?
It makes me think about what direction the conclave is going to be taking, whether they're going to go back to things that are based on doctrine of the Catholic Church, or if they're going to follow the most recent example of reaching out and taking care of people that have been colonized.
Yeah. And so we're going to get to some questions in just a second. I'm going to hold questions to the end because I've got a lot to go through and still rambling here. But we get to this world where we're now in a post-colonial reality. Like we don't live in a colonial mindset, at least in America anymore. Do we still live in an imperial world? Perhaps. But I think we are in a post-colonial era of theology, at least. At least that's where I'm hoping we're moving the church. What is so interesting about this is that with the horrors of imperialism and with the horrors of colonialization, you would think that as we move into this post-colonial ideal, that there would be a complete rejection of everything that was connected to the colonialist powers. So you would say that, like, when a country gains its independence from Britain, that there would be, well, get rid of the Church of England. We don't need that anymore. We've got something else. That's not what we see happening. And so Dr. Heaney asked the question about why. And he presents this idea of hybridization. And this is an idea, as he defines it, a strategy employed towards decolonization that subverts the power of colonial authority and culture by mixing with, for example, cultural practices, language, philosophy, and text from the colonized culture. Imperialist practice and text often assume a binary way of looking at the world, interpreting the world, and teaching the world. There are those who are civilized, and there are those who are uncivilized. There are those who are developed, and there are those who are underdeveloped. There are those who are heathens, and there are those who are believers. Imperialist mission seeks then to civilize subjects by advancing them from their unenlightened state into higher and purer forms of belief and behavior. So a little summation there of what imperialist mission is trying to do, but then we get into this idea of hybridization. Hybridization is not a direct move to overthrow domineering colonialist culture. This may be because of a rejection of the binaries of opposition, or because the power differential would make it virtually impossible for the local to compete with the imperialist. The strategy of hybridization aims at interrupting the supposed imperialist superiority. And this is my favorite line. I've been using it a lot recently, but the rejection of the binaries of opposition, of being able to say, it's not black and white. There are things that, as society moves, as world history develops, there are ideas that take hold and take root. And so the fact that people still want to be connected with the loving teachings of Jesus Christ after we have completely destroyed them and told them they're something different than what they are is a really powerful thing. The average Anglican today is a woman living in sub-Saharan Africa. If you look at the statistical average of the Anglican Church, that is what the average Anglican is today. And so that's a complete power shift from what was the Church of England to now being this globalized Anglican communion that is predominantly by people that otherwise would have been on the margins of this Church of England, of this British Empire at one point in history, and maybe even still today. So this hybridization piece is a way of understanding why people want to still be connected with this church that has a colonial imperialist past, and what they're doing to bring that into a full and loving understanding of what Jesus Christ is calling them to do. And so that's a really powerful thing, and we see that happening a lot. We see that tying to our Missio Dei. We see this tying back to our statement about Jesus as our epistemology. Hybridization is what Jesus does. Jesus goes into the world, and he makes he makes God relatable to the marginalized. He goes to the farmers. He goes to the fisher. He goes to a grassroots approach of saying, don't worry about the power structures of the world as they are today, because they're not going to exist forever. Worry about being connected to each other and being connected to God. That's hybridization. And that's what we see Jesus doing in the gospel. And I'm going to hit you here with what I think is an incredibly powerful statement about God. The incarnation means that God is colonized. Think about it for a minute. This is one of Dr. Heaney's, he wrote a fantastic book on post-colonial theology, and this is one of his major takeaways. The incarnation means that God is colonized. He writes, Jesus was a colonized person and a member of a colonized people. Jesus did not choose the simple dualism of colonized colonizer, friend, enemy, liberator, oppressor, associated with many revolutionaries. The path that leads to a limited liberation, that path leads to a limited liberation that depends on building up one's identity against the identity of the other. It demands a cutting off of the other. In contrast, the major tenor of Christ's mission was to opt for transformation through the power of deep relationality and connectedness. We talk about God coming down into the world. That's the wonderful thing about the incarnation, is that God comes down to us to be a part of our world, to see what it's like to be human, to be a part of the sinfulness that is around us, the brokenness that is around us. And so God does not come down into a place of glory and power. God comes down into a marginalized, colonized individual that we call Jesus Christ. God is a product of colonization, this piece that ties God to a deeply marginalized people is incredibly powerful. And so we get to this place then where we're thinking about to the ends of the earth, about how all of this is wrapped up in this Missio Dei, about how God has come down to be a part of not the power structures of the day, but of the people affected by the power structures in whatever form they take shape in. And so there's a piece of this which I don't have time to get into today, but is so important because I haven't gotten to the whole point of today's conversation, which is the missional questions we're going to be left with, but that's what we're going to spend the next 4 weeks looking at. But I just want to note that there is such an important piece about church repentance in this ecclesial repentance of how we need to say sorry for these things that we have participated in, of which we are still participating in, of which we take benefit from daily. And that's a major question of this as well, which maybe we'll get into at a later time. But I want to leave us with these 4 theses of mission, and then finally 4 questions for missional discernment that we get from Dr. Heaney. So these 4 theses here that are only a theology of mission guarantees a future. So that's a statement tying it to Missio Dei. So this understanding of what God is doing is part of what we need to be doing, and how we discern that leads us to our mission. We have to have a robust theology of mission, a robust theology of the Missio Dei, if we want to engage with mission. Because that's iterated by the second point, that syncretism is only avoided by reuniting church in mission. Again, reiterating this idea that the Western church has fallen into syncretism, this conflating of the ideas of Western society with what the church wants as well, which is not where we necessarily want to be. Remembering then that, the church is only participating in mission when it is participating in God's mission. So therefore, mission is not an activity of the church, it is the identity of the church. It is not something we are doing, it's who we are, which is an important thing as well. Mission is never simply local. It's talking about how, because of hybridization, because of the globalized nature, because of our interconnectedness to everyone, what we believe about what we are doing here is just as well connected to what we believe about what other people are doing in the rest of the world as well. So this interconnectedness is very important to us. Again, to the ends of the earth is that statement. It's larger than what we are doing. We are participating in this larger understanding of God's work. And then reconciliation means expansive ecumenism. So if we see God reconciling all of the forces going on in the times of Jesus and trying to make sense of them. And if we take all of the things that we have gotten wrong, like being too close to the castle, having very particular things that we define as pure and what it is, that means that we're going to have to let some of those go if we want to believe into a fuller vision of what God is asking us to do. So part of that apology, part of saying, I'm sorry for this, is believing that another way might just be as valid as the way that we understand God as well. So that is an expansive ecumenism, allowing us to understand that God's identity takes many forms in the world, or at least the expression of that identity, that missional understanding, takes many forms. That's part of expansive ecumenism. And so here are our 4 questions. So what we're going to do in our next 4 classes is we're going to take the marks of mission that we looked at, and we're going to connect them into these missional discernment questions that Heaney has posed for us as well. Because one is like, here's what we should be doing, and here's how we make sure it's not living up to ways that we've done it wrong in the past. So these are important questions, and what I'm going to do is give you a sheet that surmises the last 2 weeks next week. Because we talked about a lot of stuff, there's a lot of quotes that I know people have asked for. I'll get you all that next week. It's easier than sharing the slides because it'll be more concise and maybe make sense, but that's for later. Here are the questions. I'm not going to go into depth about what they might mean for us today, but let's just read them today. How might our preaching, teaching, and process of formation teach a passive faith that baptizes the status quo? How do I understand the cultural expression of the faith in my context? How do I understand the contextualization, that is, the expressing of the faith according to the cultural resources of a given place? And how is it practiced for the sake of those outside the church in my setting? Where and when in my context does the church rise above dominant assumptions of the reigning power to bring a distinct and even prophetic voice to the public sphere? And to what extent does cooperation and partnership, both ecumenical and interreligious, shape my discernment and ministry priorities? These are really powerful questions, and I hope you can see with a bit of what we've talked about, this idea that we've got to be connected to understanding our past, the understanding that where it has gone wrong in the past is because we haven't been discerning what God is actually asking us to do. And we've conflated our own sense of what we want out of the world with what God wants. And so making sure that we're not doing that. If we want to avoid syncretism, if we want to avoid some of these imperial tendencies of which we are close to, are benefactors of, then we've got to be asking questions about, are we making sure that what we're doing isn't advancing something that I have a bias towards, or advancing something that is deeply ingrained with how I understand myself, and that is tied back to something that missionally, theologically, is not correct. And so those are really important questions, and these are helpful frameworks. It's 10 o'clock. We'll have time to maybe expand on these at a later date. But what we're going to do next week is we're going to have 2 expressions of our own missional identity coming. So Ed Zielogowski will be with us, and we'll be talking about the lunch ministry. So looking at the lunch ministry through this lens, but also about how we have this new idea that has been asked of us, and part of our discernment about what's going on in our community. We have lots of folks that are affected by Alzheimer's and memory care issues. And so what does it mean to support the caregivers of those individuals? And so that's a new idea that we have. But I thought it would be fun to kind of take the lens that we've developed here and take something that's new and say, well, how do we make sure we craft this in a way that is sustainable and giving us life, and make sure we're not falling into the pitfalls of this? So taking an established idea that we already participate in and a new idea and kind of working back with those. So that'll be more of a conversation next week. So I think we'll be able to work with some of the practical applications of these questions. So that's why we're not going to get too much into their practical application today. But I think these are really important. And what we'll do next week is I'll have these together for you so you can sit with them and wrestle with them yourselves. But I'll entertain one question before I have to run away.
Dan.
So you mentioned earlier in your slides about God kind of not using violence to impose, but I think there are examples throughout, especially the Old Testament, of violence and war and kind of being enabled by God. And so like, I think part of what I wrestle with is, while I agree that I don't think that is a way going forward, I do see kind of some of those imperialist tendencies justified, or the justification applied from those historical examples. How do we wrestle with that in terms of combating that?
Yeah.
That's a great question. And a 2-minute answer probably will not suffice. But for those that didn't hear it, the question of, the imperialist tendencies you could make a case for, they exist in the Old Testament in lots of ways. So this idea that violence is not necessarily part of God, you could counteract that with something that you see in the Old Testament, which is certainly true. There's lots of violence. For me, I would start that answer by looking at, what is your understanding of biblical interpretation of how these stories are being told? Often in the Old Testament, we're talking about a story being told about someone that is marginalized and is excited about the overthrow of their imperialist overlord and the way that God is providing for that. And so you can have this conversation that the historicity of this is not as black and white as a lot of people interpret it to be, but also that the theological implications of that are about God being involved in people's lives in a way that is overthrowing this imperialist tendency. And the implications of that being violent are certainly true, but I think that's a really important question about how we are understanding the historicity of this, of saying, is that actually how it happened? Or is this a story of a marginalized people telling their story of victory, which is an important interpretation. So that's the first half. The second half of that, within Missio Dei, I would say is, again, it gets back to this, WWJD, what did Jesus do? And so that's a foundational statement, and I don't want to throw away. We're not throwing away the Old Testament. We cannot throw away the Old Testament. We're not going to do that. We're not saying that the Old Testament isn't valid anymore. It's deeply foundational to who we are as children of God. It's how God is involved in people's lives. But it is a new question that when Jesus comes, we do believe in a new covenant, this new understanding of the world, of how we are supposed to be in the world and express our love. And that's how we understand God, is through the teachings of Jesus Christ. And so that's that piece of revelatory it's the piece of revelation that is so important to the understanding of this theology, of saying that if we can't tie it back to a missional practice of Jesus or to our teaching of Jesus, it might not fit into our theology. So that's a way to counteract the violence. We see Jesus rejecting violence at every turn. He does not fight the Romans as he goes to be crucified. He tells his disciples to put away their swords. We see an anti-violent nature to Jesus. We see a pacifist nature to Jesus. And so that's deeply foundational to how we have to understand how we act as well. So that's the short answer to that. But that's a really fantastic question. And I think it's a wonderful way of kind of encapsulating some of the practical applications of this theology. I'm well over time. I got to get to the next service, but we'll see you next week. Thanks, everybody.